Hello and welcome to the Global Poker League and our new strategy segment where we ask our guest pro to take us through a hand from the GPL in great detail. Fortunate enough to be joined once again by Mr. Jonathan Little of the Las Vegas Moneymakers. He's going to take us through a hand involving George Danza and Anatoly Filatov in the heads-up segment of the Eurasian Conference. Jonathan, what was it about this hand that really caught your eye?
Well, I really enjoy watching Anatoly play. Anatoly clearly likes to fight for pots, and he is not afraid to get out of line if he thinks it's a good play. So notice here, Anatoly has gotten a little bit short-stacked because of exactly that. He was fighting a little bit too hard for pots.
Too hard, yeah.
George recognized this appropriately, and for that reason now, Anatoly's short, which is not where he wants to be. Anyway, blinds are now 600, 1200. Anatoly has about 15 big blinds or so. And George decides to limp this ace-10 offsuit. This is something that many amateur players never do. They just elect to open shove or they min raise. But it's really nice to have these type of hands in your range when you limp, because if you limp and your opponent shoves, you can very easily call. You don't want to make it to where your limps are only limp folding. You will see a lot of limping heads up in the Global Poker League just because that is a nice strategy. It's a hard strategy to take advantage of. And there are various reasons for that, and we discussed that in the commentary as we have watched the games live.
You see the flop comes 3-5-3, which got a bit of a miss for both players, but still gets interesting, doesn't it?
A little tip for all poker players. Whenever the flop comes, try to rearrange it to the biggest card to the smallest card. So 5-3-3, because that will help you remember the hands a little bit better. If the cards are sort of discombobulated, it's harder to recount the hands in the future. So a little pro tip there.
Thanks, Jonathan Little. Always getting pro tips from a guest here at the GPL.
Say it comes like 3-5-3, you'd say 5-5-3 or 5-3-3. Turns like a 9, you want to put that one as a 9 so you know it's a turn. Anyway, tiny little tips here. All right, so Anatoly's going to check the flop as he should. George Danza decides to make a small bet, just a one big blind bet. I think you should make that bet with a very, very wide range. And this is now where Anatoly pounces again like the rabid Wolverine he is. Even with this tiny stack, a lot of people never bluff with these tiny stacks, but this is something Anatoly seems to like to do. We also saw Timothy Adams make, Timothy Adams, tongue twister of a name. Timothy Adams, he made a similar play on a paired board like this. This is actually the second time we've seen Anatoly do such a thing. So let's see what happens. He elects to check raise tiny. I was a bit surprised at this. But notice here, if Anatoly has a premium hand, he does not really mind if George calls. Because George, he's going to be able to get his whole stack in by the river, no matter what. It's a little bit different when we're playing 100 big blinds deep, where you need to check raise much larger. Usually when you're check raising, you're doing that to give yourself the option to play a big pot by the river. Here, if he just bets a turn and then bets the river, he's going to be all in.
We see the 10, which has come off, which pairs George Danza.
Well, let's talk about George's flop call. I think that's also a very tough spot. I think George just has to call with ace highs. But if he had a hand like jack high or queen high or king high, maybe he's supposed to fold even that tiny raise. But George is not a pushover. So I'm not sure I would have attempted this against exactly George Danza. But I think Anatoly did get the vibe that George was playing a little bit tight in this game. So maybe he thought that he would fold out ace highs. So anyway, turns to 10. Anatoly correctly realizes George has something. I'm not going to try to bluff him off as something. So he checks, and then George makes the really sweet play of checking behind. And the purpose of checking behind here is that if Anatoly is bluffing, he certainly has the worst hand, and he's not going to call if he bets. He's only going to call if he has perhaps a 5 or better, which he may not even check raise a 5 in the first place. So he's always going to call if he has a 3 that you lose to, and you don't want to get stacked if you don't have to. We've seen, go ahead.
Some amateurs might think the checking behind on the 10 is a bit of a risky play because there's a lot of cards that can come higher than a 10 in your king, queen, ace. From a kind of amateur's perspective, that's probably a play you see slightly less frequently. You think this is a good play to check behind this 10? This
is a particularly good spot to check behind because think about how many cards are actually bad for him. The ace is great, right? Then you just have top 2 pair. The king is bad, but if your opponent's bluffing, they probably don't have a king because a lot of king highs will just check call on the flop. If they have a queen is probably a reasonably bad card because maybe your opponent does try to bluff a queen high. A jack's also probably a reasonably bad card, but that's only 2 cards in the deck that are actually bad. Notice there are no flush draws on the flop. It's pretty hard for your opponent to have exactly a backdoor heart draw, and if they did, they may just continue betting with that. So he's pretty well protected here. He's going to have the best hand on the river a lot of the time if he has the best hand on the turn. And this is a great example of this, how he's getting bluffed by jack high. On a jack he loses, and he's going to pay him off on a jack, but whatever. You lose the few times the jack comes, but every other time you're going to win. Maybe he has to worry about a 7 or a 2 if Anatoly has a hand like 6-4, so those are also minor concerns. But really, the vast majority of the time, this is a spot where you don't need protection. It's a little bit different if the turn was, say, a 6, because, and George had a 6, let's say at a6 in terms of 6. Maybe then he would want to bet, because then he does want to protect versus queen jacks and stuff like that. But this is a spot where I think checking behind is great, especially if you think Anatoly has either the nuts or nothing, which is likely what's going on here. And you lose, and this is because George loses to the nuts, even with his top pair, top kicker, and he crushes all the bluffs. And Anatoly was actually saying in the commentary, he did great commentary, by the way, both these players did. I want to thank them for that. Very insightful. That he was just giving up on the turn. It was check folding. His one small flop check raise did not work. He was trying to get George to fold out a lot of junk, and it didn't work, so he was giving up. But now, when he goes check on the turn, he goes back to thinking George has something like ace high or king high. And now, maybe you can get him to fold out with a reasonable bet. So that is exactly what he does. He gets, by George checking behind, he gets Anatoly to put an additional 2,900 in the spot. In a spot where many players would have missed out on that 2,900 value because they would have just bet return and picked it up. So Anatoly does bet, and George has shown great discipline in not raising super thin for value in a lot of river spots. He just likes to call. And I think that's a good play because, again, Anatoly either has a 3, which he's always going to call with, or he has nothing, which he's never going to call with. So that's a spot where calling in George's spot makes a lot of sense. He does call, and he wins a nice pot and continues to chip down Anatoly, and he ended up not getting swept.
Yeah, I mean, pulled one back at the end after going 2-0 down. But yeah, a nice little play there from George Danza. That's the end of this segment, guys. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Jonathan, our guest host, and join us again next time. Adios. Connect with us on social media for league updates and download our app, GPL TV, to stay on top of everything GPL.